Millionaire CEO finds lost child. Her words broke him. James Carter, the formidable mind behind Carter Tech and a man once praised on the cover of Fortune magazine, walked out of his towering glass office on Fifth Avenue as midnight approached. His footsteps echoed off the polished marble of the lobby, the clicking of his shoes sharp against the backdrop of soft rain tapping on the revolving doors. James had always believed in routine, discipline, and numbers, things that didn't lie, didn't change, and didn't feel. Emotions were liabilities, and he had locked his away years ago. But as the heavy glass doors swung open and the cool night air brushed against his face, a disturbance interrupted the seamless rhythm of his exit. Just beyond the steps, something small and unmoving caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a discarded bag, or maybe some street trash caught in the rain. But as he squinted through the drizzle, he realized it was a child, a little girl, no older than 7, soaked to the bone, sitting hunched on the steps like a broken doll left behind. Her blonde hair was matted and dripping, her thin arms wrapped around a dirty teddy bear, and her pale knees pressed tightly to her chest. James felt a strange chill, not from the cold, but from something else, something unfamiliar. Concern. The girl's cheeks were streaked with tears and rainwater. Her small face lifted toward him slowly, as if struggling to trust her own hope. Her lips parted, and a hoarse voice cracked the silence between them. "Please help her, my mom's not waking up." The words didn't register at first. James stood there, confused, like someone hearing a foreign language for the first time. But then the weight of the plea hit him, sharp and sobering. He took a step forward, staring down at the girl, trying to make sense of the moment. She didn't beg for money or food, only help, for someone else. His heart, usually buried beneath spreadsheets and stock reports, skipped a beat. "Where is she?" he asked, voice low, unsure. The girl clutched her teddy bear tighter, pointing a trembling finger down the street, toward the shadows between buildings. "She's in the alley. She's not moving. I tried, but she won't wake up." Her words came in stutters, half swallowed by the lump in her throat. James hesitated, battling the voice in his head telling him to walk away, to call security, to return to his normal, emotionless routine. But another voice, the quiet, distant echo of his younger self, pleaded for him not to turn his back. James had known abandonment, had known the sting of being ignored, unseen, uncared for. He saw that same desperation mirrored in the girl's wide, tear-glassed eyes. Against every instinct he had spent years sharpening, he found himself reaching out a hand. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Sophie," she whispered, as if afraid he might disappear if she spoke too loudly. Her small hand slipped into his, cold and soaked, but trusting. With each step they took toward the alley she'd pointed to, the pounding in his chest grew louder, no longer drowned by logic or business strategy. He had led teams through billion-dollar mergers and technological revolutions, but now, following a child into a dark alley, he felt more vulnerable than he ever had. The streetlights flickered overhead, and passing cars sent splashes over the sidewalk, but James barely noticed. All that mattered was Sophie's tiny hand and the urgency in her voice. His shoes splashed through puddles, his expensive suit clinging to his skin, and yet he didn't care. The rain intensified, mixing with the storm beginning to brew inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profits or headlines. He was thinking about a child, about her mother, about the helplessness in her voice, and about the version of himself that might have been saved if someone, anyone, had once reached out like this. James moved quickly now, led by Sophie's fragile hand as she guided him through the wet streets, the city growing darker and quieter with every step they took away from the bright lights of Fifth Avenue. She didn't speak again, and he didn't press her. There was urgency in her tiny steps, a strange determination that didn't match her size or age. They turned a corner, and the world shifted. The sleek city vanished, replaced by shadows, garbage bins, and silence that felt unnatural. James had passed alleys like these 1,000 times before without ever turning his head, but tonight he stepped into one. The dim glow of a single, flickering street lamp barely lit the space ahead, where a figure lay slumped against the wall behind a rusted dumpster, her body almost completely hidden beneath a tattered raincoat. Sophie let go of his hand and rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the woman. "Mama," she whispered, gently shaking her. The woman didn't respond. James crouched down, scanning her face, ashen, lips cracked, her eyelids fluttering weakly like she was trapped in a fading dream. Her clothes were soaked through, her fingers stiff with cold, and her breath shallow, too shallow. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. As he gave the address to the dispatcher, his voice wavered despite his usual calm control. "Female, late 20s, unconscious, breathing is irregular. We need an ambulance now," he said, staring at the frail woman who was clearly fighting just to stay alive. Sophie sat beside her mother, placing the teddy bear on her chest, as if that might somehow bring her back. James stayed close, rain running down his forehead, eyes locked on the woman's face. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, but he didn't understand why. Not yet. Then, quietly, Sophie tugged at the edge of his coat and leaned in close. "She didn't eat for 3 days, she murmured. "She gave it all to me, even when she was hungry." Her voice cracked, and James turned his eyes away, unable to meet hers for a moment. He felt something heavy shift inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He watched Sophie press her tiny hand against her mother's cheek, whispering her name again and again, trying to pull her back with nothing but love and hope. The sirens were distant, but growing louder, an eerie melody against the steady beat of rain on asphalt. James remained crouched beside them, his mind spiraling, not because of the scene before him, but because of what it stirred in his own past. He hadn't thought of his mother in years, not since the day she overdosed in a motel bathroom while he waited outside with his backpack, unaware she was already gone. He had pushed the memory deep down, locked it behind ambition and steel ambition. But now, staring at a child protecting her mother, starving so her daughter could eat, that memory clawed its way back. He remembered what it felt like to be forgotten by the world. He remembered the ambulance that came too late. But this time, he had a chance to do something different, to make sure help arrived in time. As the wail of the sirens neared the alley, Sophie reached out and took his hand again, as if somehow she already knew his silence came from a place of understanding. Her fingers were freezing, but steady. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked. James wanted to promise her. He wanted to say yes, but the words stuck in his throat. "She's strong," he managed, "and help is almost here." The ambulance lights painted the walls red and white as it turned into the alley, splashing water against the curb. Paramedics jumped out, moving with urgency, taking the woman's vitals, loading her carefully onto the stretcher. Sophie tried to climb up with her, but they gently stopped her. She looked around, panicked. "Don't let her go without me," she cried. James stepped forward. "She won't," he said firmly. "You're coming too." The medics hesitated, then nodded. One of them scooped Sophie into the ambulance beside her mother. Before the doors closed, James caught one last look at the girl, sitting beside the unconscious woman, holding her hand like an anchor. Then the sirens blared again, and they were gone, swallowed by the night. James stood in the alley, soaked and motionless. He didn't know why his hands were shaking, why his throat was tight. He only knew one thing for sure. Sophie's voice, those quiet words about her mother's sacrifice, had split something open inside him. Something he thought had been buried forever. James stepped into the bright hospital lobby, the fluorescent lights stinging his tired eyes after hours spent in the dim alley. Nurses rushed by with clipboards, patients lined the waiting room chairs, and the scent of antiseptic hung thick in the air. But none of it mattered. His eyes followed the stretcher being wheeled into the emergency wing, where Angela disappeared behind double doors. Sophie clung to him, one hand wrapped tightly around his, the other still holding her bare. He didn't let go. He couldn't. A nurse tried to separate them gently, asking James if he was a relative. He hesitated. Technically, he wasn't even a friend. But something about that word, relative, made his chest tighten. "I'm staying with her," he said firmly. Hours passed. Sophie curled up on a stiff plastic bench beside him, and James sat still, barely moving, barely blinking. His phone buzzed on the seat next to him, calls from his assistant, emails piling up, board members trying to schedule an emergency conference about a stock dip. But he silenced them all. He wasn't going anywhere. Not tonight. A doctor finally approached, her voice calm but grave. "She's stable for now," she said. "But she was severely dehydrated. Pneumonia in both lungs. She needs rest, nutrition and warmth. It's good you brought her when you did," Jameson nodded, unsure of how to respond. Sophie stirred beside him and looked up, eyes heavy but alert. "Can I see her?" she asked. The doctor gave a gentle smile. "Soon. She's resting." James took a deep breath. Something inside him softened. As morning light crept through the hospital windows, he left briefly, not to return to work, but to visit a nearby shelter. He asked for a clean outfit in Sophie's size, a small blanket, and anything familiar they could spare. An old volunteer handed him a pink backpack and a stuffed unicorn, saying, "She left these behind last week." Back at the hospital, Sophie's eyes lit up as James handed her the bag. She hugged the unicorn tight, smiling for the first time since he met her. "Thanks," she whispered. He nodded. "I figured you'd want your friend back." Later that evening, James sat beside Sophie in the pediatric waiting lounge, sharing crackers from a vending machine. She watched him intently, her head tilted slightly. "You dress nice," she said out of nowhere. "Are you rich?" The question caught him off guard. He laughed a little awkwardly. "Kind of," he said with a shrug. Sophie didn't blink. She looked at him again, more seriously this time. "Then why are you alone?" The question landed like a stone in his chest. He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. The silence between them stretched, and Sophie didn't push. She just leaned against him, content to sit quietly with her unicorn. James stared at the floor, her words repeating in his mind over and over. Why was he alone? He had built towers, conquered industries, sat at the top of a skyscraper. But here, in this hospital, with this little girl resting against his side, he realized he had no one to call, no one to come sit beside him. Not a friend, not a family member, just headlines and handshakes. Sophie shifted in her seat and asked softly, "Do you think my mom will lie see? You?" The question startled him. I hope so," he replied. And to his surprise, he meant it. Sophie smiled again, more hopeful this time. "I think she will. You're nice." That word, nice, felt so foreign to him. He wasn't used to being described that way. Ruthless, strategic, efficient. Those were the words that followed him in boardrooms. Not nice, not kind. But maybe, just maybe, he was starting to be. As night returned, James tucked Sophie in with the blanket he brought, watching her drift off to sleep curled beside her unicorn. He stayed by her side, unmoving, while the hospital hummed around them. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a stranger to his own life. He felt something stir, a sense of purpose beyond numbers and deals. He looked through the hospital window, at the sleeping city below, and realized he didn't want to go back to who he was. Not now. Not after Sophie. Angela's eyes blinked open slowly, sunlight warming her cheeks as soft hospital sheets crinkled beneath her. The first face she saw wasn't a doctor. It was Sophie, curled beside her on the chair, and James standing quietly by the window, coffee in hand, watching them with an expression she didn't understand. Relief, concern, maybe even something like pride. She blinked again, disoriented, her voice hoarse. What happened?" Sophie stood up and hugged her gently, tears spilling down her cheeks. You scared me, she whispered. Angela wrapped a weak arm around her daughter, holding her like something precious she almost lost. James stepped forward only when she looked up. He didn't speak at first. He just nodded. You're safe, he said finally. You're both safe now. Days passed, then weeks. Angela recovered slowly, her body still fragile but gaining strength with each meal, each full night's rest. James visited daily, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with Sophie's favorite juice boxes. He brought laughter into the room without even realizing it, awkward, quiet, and unsure of himself, but more present than any man La had ever known. One afternoon, as Sophie napped by the window, Angela spoke softly, her eyes still fixed on her daughter. I had no one left, she said. No one. I never thought someone like you would stop to care. You didn't even know us. Her voice cracked, but James didn't interrupt. He let her speak, let her vulnerability hang in the space between them. I wasn't always like this, she added. Life just kept getting smaller, until it was just her and me. I was so tired. James looked at her with quiet understanding. You don't have to explain, he said. Not to me. And he meant it. What came next shocked even him. At his next board meeting, held via video call from the hospital cafeteria, he announced a leave of absence. Silence fell across the screen. Executives stared, stunned. I'll be stepping away, he told them. Indefinitely. Gasps followed. One of the board members muttered, You're walking away from your own empire? James leaned closer to the screen. No, he said simply. I'm walking towards something better. He closed his laptop, left the building, and never looked back. With his connections, he found Angela a job at a boutique coffee shop not far from the hospital. Nothing fancy, but safe. Flexible. A fresh start. He offered them an apartment he'd bought years ago, a cozy 2-bedroom tucked inside a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn. Angela hesitated at first, unsure how to accept something so generous. But James was patient. He let her choose. Eventually she said yes. He bought Sophie a bike, painted her room pink, stocked the fridge with snacks she liked. He was still unsure what he was becoming, but it didn't matter. He was becoming. Months passed, and the routine became their rhythm. School drop-offs, storybooks, weekend breakfasts that smelled like cinnamon and burnt toast. He still had his penthouse, still kept up with company updates. But his heart was no longer in skyscrapers. It was in a small apartment with a girl who called him her best friend, and a woman who smiled every time he walked through the door. Then, one evening in early spring, Sophie performed in her school's spring play. A little cardboard stage, paper flowers taped to the back wall, children in mismatched costumes shouting lines they'd half memorized. James sat in the third row beside Angela, dressed in jeans and a jacket for once, clapping politely until Sophie stepped forward for her line. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they found him. Then, beaming, she shouted louder than the script required. I told everyone! You're the guy who saved my whole life! The room went quiet, then erupted into applause, but James didn't hear it. He was too busy wiping tears from his eyes, his chest tight with a feeling he couldn't name. Angela squeezed his hand. She's right, she whispered. And in that moment, James realized he hadn't just rescued them from a dark alley or a lonely hospital. He had pulled himself out too, from years of emptiness, of walls too high and rooms too cold. He looked at Sophie on stage, arms wide open in victory, and smiled through tears. He hadn't just saved a family. He had finally found one, and this time he wasn't letting go. He